Okay, so as I earlier said, Marissa was flying in. She got in really late. She's a little bit spacey, but she's really, really good. So if some things are sounding a little bit off, please be empathetic, be kind.
And feel free to ask clarifying questions. Like I've literally studied like 3 or 4 hours in the past, whatever.
Also, I hope you can hear. So yeah, there's still some room up front. So if you're way in the back, maybe you want to move a little bit closer. But yeah, feel free to say, hey, say it again, I can't hear you. And also, the way we always ran this is like a fireside chat for all the new people. We would talk casually, and your engagement is really important. So make sure you ask questions. Not wait until the end, but whenever you feel like you have a question, raise your hand. And let's try to make this official part 45 minutes to an hour, and then and we can also chat casually after as well. Okay, cool. So Marissa Fong is here. She's going to tell you a little bit about herself, what she did for the past few years. And then we wanted to focus on roadmaps, but if you guys drag that conversation in a different direction, that's fine too. If you're like, oh, maybe I'm not really into roadmaps because she said something that's more interesting and you want to explore that, that's fine. Okay, cool? Oh, and she's eating candy right now.
I just need the sugar. Well, thank you everyone so much for having me here. I mean, this is as much a learning opportunity for me as I think, like I've heard everyone's interested in just hearing about my experiences in the US. So, a little about me. I'm originally from San Francisco, Silicon Valley, but from San Francisco, the original city. And I actually started international development because I was really, really interested in sort of social issues. And started out in consulting and various different types of consulting, which has been really valuable for my career. So worked at management consulting with one of the big, I think 3 or 4, Booz Allen Hamilton, and then did some brand strategy. And while I was in consulting, I realized that I liked the strategy part, but didn't get the implementation portion of it. And I was offered a role within Booz Allen to do project management because that was what was there at the time. And I thought, well, there's no ownership with that. What can I do with it? So I took some time off and actually worked in East and South Africa doing some NGO work. And while I was there, I got connected with a former colleague of mine who told me that Amex was a great place to really cut my teeth on pure product management. But more from
American Express, sometimes we don't understand.
Oh, got it, yeah, American Express. Okay. So if anyone has a card, it's really awesome. So with American Express, I was very lucky. When I got back from East and South Africa, I was able to navigate to a role within Amex because they hired a lot of former consultants. And so my first role was in membership rewards, working on their features and functionality. And at the time, what was interesting about it was that Amex was going through a huge transformation digitally. And so they were looking at what right now we'd call it a lift, but it was essentially a re-platforming and a redesign. And so my role was really working across the whole organization with all the various stakeholders because membership rewards was really the crown jewel of the organization to figure out how to launch this new website. And what was fascinating about it was I was working on it for about a year and it still didn't kick off. So obviously there are challenges with that, with such a large organization trying to get something through and to transform. But the way Amex works is that you navigate and you go and you basically look for a different role every few years. It's an up or out culture, which I'm very familiar with consulting. So I was able to navigate into several different roles after that. One of which was launching the corporate membership rewards product, and then ultimately leading a team of 5 PMs with a global portfolio of products in travel. And that was just amazing because we were going through a huge transformation in travel as well. And as you all know, travel is very, very hard. There's a lot of offline experience, there's a lot of complexity. Looking at travel in different pieces from one product that had a front end and a back end that was software as a service, to then looking at one of our core platforms, which is our document delivery products. So super fun, but I burned out a little bit since I was traveling between 3 different cities and leading a global portfolio. And so within the last couple of years, really, then cut my teeth in startups from pre-seed to Series C. So one of the startups was called Quartet Health, and it's one of the, the buzzier startups in New York, funded by Google Ventures. worked as a PM there, and then most recently transitioned to work with VCs, but specifically inside venture partners with helping scale their portfolio companies, but specifically in the product space. So there's kind of a lot there with kind of seeing how enterprises work within product, how enterprises transforms to startup space, and what really matters for product management within startups. And then also how product management changes within the startup space, because especially with growth stage companies, it becomes really, really interesting with how product has to change. So I'm happy to share any part of my experience with those types of companies with everyone here.
Yeah, thank you. If there are any questions at this point, feel free to ask. If not, I've got my questions, and I'm just going to go with what I've prepared. Anyone? Okay, so what I really wanted to ask is about roadmaps. We know that one of the key things for any product manager is to be the leader in creating the roadmap for the company, for the product, or multiple products, right? Because Marissa comes from such a broad experience, and especially with big companies and complex situations, I wanted to dig deeper into that topic. So first of all, if you can share your point of view, what is roadmap and why it's important with everyone?
Yeah, and this topic has been really interesting to me too, because I've seen recently how roadmaps are developed. So ultimately, a roadmap is a communication tool, but it's a very strategic communication tool. It's how you share your strategic intent for your products and how you're going to get to delivering the strategy. And the reason I call it specifically a tool is it's not really the prioritization methodology. It's really the way you're sharing your thoughts with various stakeholders. And it's really important because it provides transparency and ultimately cultivates trust. And that's why it comes in different formats too, depending on whether you're an enterprise or a startup. And it's also a way to potentially break the trust if you don't deliver on what you're promising with the roadmap. And I'm going to say that also very loosely, because sometimes a roadmap may not have deadlines. But ultimately it is, in a way of communication, and a way of transparency, and a way of building trust.
Yeah, and with roadmaps, so we're bringing up startup and enterprise, right? And I think that there are different challenges in each environment. Can you speak to that a little bit? What's your experience with challenges in startup, and what's your experience with challenges in enterprise?
Yeah. So I bring up transparency and trust a lot because ultimately management wants to know if you're working on the things that will deliver the value that they need or to deliver to targets. So for example, when I was at American Express in business travel, one of the big things that we were working through is a huge transformation that would ultimately deliver value within a 3-year time period so that the investors can get back their funds. So to do that, the strategic planning was actually done right when the acquisition happened, and then we were all ultimately required to use our various products to deliver upon those goals. And what that meant was management had very, very key needs on 5, 6 big bets. And funding was allocated for those big bets. And to make those big bets convert the value that they needed, you needed hard dates and deadlines. And part of that was also required because in the travel space, if anyone's familiar with it, all of travel sits on legacy. They sit on these big GDSs. They're very old. They're like our president actually came from one of the GDSs because he built it. And to make these huge legacy systems move, you have to mobilize basically years in advance. So one of my products touched those legacy products, which meant that I had huge dependencies from other PMs that I had to align with. I also needed to consider regulation and the financial obligations that were required for Amex, as well as resourcing and plan that basically to a T. And part of that planning also meant socializing and connecting with my stakeholders to beg for things that I needed and or negotiate. And so with enterprises, there tends to be, I don't want to say less trust, but there tends to be much more in terms of dependencies and needs for alignment for dates, depending on what your products are. What I find with the startup space and some of the needs for some of the, I would say the growth stage companies, is that sometimes you don't have product market fit. and it's about finding the product market fit and or adjusting to different dates and different targets that are identified because things are moving so quickly. And with that, organizations tend to have OKRs that may not have a mission or vision, and then that adds additional complexity. So if you're working with a roadmap where we're not working with dates or specific initiatives, the challenges are trying to figure out what the mission is, trying to figure out maybe sometimes even what the OKRs are, and then working with various initiatives or different tests and experiments to see what value you can bring. And so that brings a whole different type of complexity because you're trying to deliver on things that you may not even know what you're trying to deliver on. And if you only own a feature as part of a bigger product, so for example, I owned the physician application, but it's part of the larger Quartet offering of servicing mental health and providing mental health options to physicians, you may have a disjointed product as a result because you're not working in line with other product managers. So there are lots of different complexities that are really organizationally related, and the key is managing the transparency and the trust and also delivering incremental value with this roadmap.
Oh, there's a brave soul.
So what I'd like to understand is, like, even before you start working on this roadmap, right, what are the critical informations you look for before you even start working on the plan?
Yeah, so there's, I would say that it may depend on industry and type of product, but there are some general pieces of information that you'd want to look for. So the big things, like, and I think of this, just so you know, as more backlog development, because then you'd want to prioritize, and then depending on what your stakeholders are looking for, that's what the roadmap is delivering, that information that you're trying to present, right? But the big things are, you want to think about what ultimately are your main product value drivers and what you're trying to deliver to your users and your customers. So the B2C space, say you have one of my products was a travel risk management product. My users were travel managers and security officers. And what my value proposition to them was, I want to make them the heroes. Because if there's a bombing in, say, Charles de Gaulle Airport, which I was in, they want to know where their travelers are. They want to be able to communicate with their travelers, and then to also be able to then identify risks and help remediate and get those travelers out. So those are the key, I would say, like, jobs to be done for these users of mine, and to be able to fulfill their needs. Because I was in the B2B space, it's also thinking about what the customers need. So customers sometimes have security requirements. They have compliance needs. We have billing requirements, ways to kind of service them, those needs. So it's really addressing the core user needs and the customer's needs. I had huge competitors because I was not exactly in the travel risk space. So I was competing head on with companies that literally did things like kidnap and ransom. So it's looking at what our competitors are doing to stay competitive and how do we differentiate ourselves and what can we offer that may be different, or I don't like to use feature parity, but what would address kind of some of those competitive friction points. We also had synergies across other products within American Express. So one of the big things was performing sort of we call them proactive travel management. So for example, I missed my connecting flight. What we try to do in the travel risk space is get ahead of that, because we know that usually what we're trying to do is, in an event that a disaster happens, we want to be able to get provide added value by figuring out how do we get them home safe before our other competitors get them safe. And so that presents a whole different set of competitors, which are the travel risk management companies, or the travel management companies that are also in this space. So the big ones are really user, customer needs, and the competitive space, and then also base requirements. And then there would be potentially a ton of other backlog items depending on what type of product you have. So sometimes your customers may have specific requirements. Ideally, you want to build a product at scale, but if there are big customers, kind of look at those. There are also big internal strategic needs and requirements. So I know that AI and machine learning right now is really big, and sometimes you have to partner with various other product managers or other teams to figure out what those requirements are and to be able to provide them within your products.
Thank you.
And I may have missed a few other ones. Sorry, I'm still a little bit tired, but those are the general buckets.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, you have mentioned this vision, mission, strategy, OKRs. How does this relate to a B2B roadmap? Like, how do you connect these? How do you connect the dots?
Yeah, so I have to caveat by also size of company and also how your product fits within the company. So in terms of, I'm going to use my travel risk management one because a lot of people thought that was a very sexy product. It was a really hard product, but it was, it seems to gravitate. So American Express Business Travel overall vision and mission was to be able to serve our corporate customers and then to be able to help our sort of users, which are travel managers, be the heroes and to be able to service their travelers and their companies. And so that in itself is, as a whole, kind of the overall, overarching sort of mission. And then individual products within the American Express travel portfolio then had different missions and visions. So for example, we had our mobile app. And the mobile app was really primarily targeted towards travelers. And it's to make their lives basically easy and to be able to help them get home safe. I had 3 different products in my portfolio. So one being the travel manager and the travel manager security officer. I had itineraries and invoices and e-tickets, which is for a whole different set. It's accounting and finance because they want to be able to see all of that together. And then I also had my portal. So I had a portal that was in 93 different markets, and it was servicing travel managers, travel arrangers, travelers, and so it needed to be kind of fixed, right? Because there's just too many users, and there's kind of all that stuff going on. So the roadmaps for each one would ladder up into servicing the overall travel managers and servicing corporations and making them the heroes. But each of my different products then would have their own different detailed mission and visions because they all had different, use cases and different value propositions. And then the roadmaps for each one would then ladder up to that individual vision and mission. So one of my goals, my goal, because it was larger enterprise, had to be tied to deadlines and had to be tied to product and loss because I actually have revenue targets with some of my products. So with my travel risk management product, it was I had to get to X in terms of revenue by a certain year and to be able to grow by X%. And to do that, my roadmap then had to be tactical. I knew then what my customers wanted and would be willing to pay for retention targets and then also for growth targets with my prospects. And so for that, those pieces then would then be delivered within a 1 to 3 year roadmap. Does that help answer your question? And that's a very specific case for B2B, large enterprise.
Yep.
That question. Since you mentioned the product market fit earlier, I want to ask, how would you approach building a product roadmap when you're still looking for the product market fit?
Yeah. So that actually would go probably with a roadmap that was more in line with developing first your vision, your overall vision to start, and it could be a hypothesis and a mission. Because if you don't really have product market fit, it's about finding that product market fit. And then thinking through then what are the experiments that you want and what are the OKRs that you want to hit. So for example, you may have a hypothesis. I'm just going to use mental health because I worked in mental health and specifically around heavy drinking. So I worked for an early seed startup that I just mentioned, actually, I went to someone else. It literally just shut down 2 days ago, which is very, very sad. And part of it, I think, was more the go-to-market. But there was a very interesting proposition in trying to help specifically the US market with heavy drinking and within companies. And so there was a hypothesis that what we were going to do was essentially to help eliminate, or not necessarily help eliminate, but help reduce the stigma around heavy drinking by approaching companies and offering a 1-year program for their employees to be able to, get a coach, have a therapist, and maybe take medication to start decreasing their reliance on heavy drinking. And so there was this huge hypothesis that we could do this with various companies. And so the first step, like our first OKR, was to be able to very simply get 1 customer. So we worked with, I don't know how, it's very complex if you all are kind of familiar with the US market, but we actually have to work with a payer, which are the insurance companies, because it's not single payer, to get them to give us data on the companies. So to get to that OKR, the first step then was not even going to our end users, our end customers, but going through the payers and see what the payers would do to give us the data. and it was working directly with the payers to figure out what was their value proposition, what would make them help, which then would be cost savings. So we went that route to start. And our roadmap is based on quarters, because we had very tight time frames to be able to deliver, since we were.
So you were time boxing your the time you allow yourself to spend on experiment,
experimenting for the OKRs.
And what did they I mean, is there some kind of average time you take for that, or it just depends on situation? Sometimes it's 2 days, sometimes it's 3 hours, depending.
For the experiments?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for the experiments, it's really dependent on how large the startups are. So, for example, at Anam, which was the startup that I worked with, we were only a 13-person shop.
Okay.
So our experiments had to be very long because I was playing the role of a PM, somewhat of a designer. Also, for those of you at startups, the PM sometimes then also, I was in charge of process, so I had to upskill my tech team on agile ceremonies and agile processes because they didn't come from that background. So our experiments then actually ended up being like 3 months at a time. And also because we didn't have easy access to those that we were experimenting with, which ultimately would be the users, the customers, and also the payers. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just to reiterate, you like basically put like experiments into the roadmap until you look at like the fit, and then do like more concrete stuff.
Yeah. So.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question? Because we had a question on that.
Oh, he didn't actually ask. He was just saying that he's actually put the experiment into the roadmap.
Yeah.
So now I feel like.
I'm just asking that was the
if
answer.
That was
right?
the good thing to do. Yes.
Yeah, because if you think about how the roadmap is a communication device, because I also use the roadmap to basically get transparency and to communicate with also my internal teams, like my Scrum teams or the squads. One way of formatting a roadmap is if you have your mission vision for that quarter, because there are hypotheses, right? And then you have your OKRs that you're trying to hit. You can literally have various initiatives by stage. So, for example, if you have a high confidence that you're gonna, say, like, you can say this, but like I feel very strongly that login is something that most people need. That you have a high confidence, you have to build like a login, right? Then you could say you develop the stage, and then you have another initiative that's just in test or that you're experimenting with.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions right now? So could we go? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So for this stage, when you're putting stuff on the roadmap, let's say the things are a bit more mature, so you're actually putting like some features on the roadmap into quarters or something, especially in a B2B environment. You obviously then need to also take input from the engineering. So what's your experience in trying to juggle or negotiate those two sides? On one side you have the stakeholders, we need to do sales in B2B, we need these features. And then on the other side, you have an engineering which is like under strict budget and stuff. How do you negotiate both?
Yeah, so if it's a delivery and feature-based roadmap, I know it's going to sound like kind of really simple, but one of the big things that I learned the hard way is to ensure that you have a buffer. Because in the B2B space, I'm assuming that you're also using your roadmap to show customers. Because what I've done in the past, especially with B2B, is you have a customer-facing roadmap and then also an internal roadmap. And the internal roadmap to start is a high-level swag. So I'm assuming that you kind of start with the swag first, and then develop almost a sense of confidence for how big the feature is going to be, and then literally break it up. And then when you have a customer roadmap, you have kind of a time horizon for your feature with a buffer. You can show that with a preliminary, and then continue to revisit that over time. Because sometimes what I found, especially with engineers, if it's a feature that, say, I'm going to use login again as an example. Like login, I would say some of my engineers felt really comfortable with something like login, but we had to rebuild a whole product from scratch. And I realized very quickly that the level of confidence for that was very low. that becomes...
Then you increase the buffer, right?
Then you increase the buffer, and because you have 2 roadmaps, you can literally change also the timing and customers. Because I find that customers are some of the bigger stakeholders that you want to manage. Then there's kind of a little bit more comfort level and trust with what you're presenting them, and with timelines changing. Because the timelines changing is more of the concern, I would think, with stakeholders with the roadmaps. And leadership also will have a better understanding of that too.
Yeah.
So does that answer your?
Yeah, that works as long as you have the ear of the stakeholders.
Yeah, and the other big thing that you may have, that I'm not sure how your processes are with roadmap socialization, but one of the big things that I realized too with a roadmap is not just the roadmap and having it shared at one point in time, but making sure that you're constantly socializing it and making sure it's very readily available.
Which kind of touches up on this. How do you share your roadmap, right?
Mm-hmm.
What tools do you use? How do you communicate this timeline changing with your customers in particular?
Yeah, so it's funny because someone mentioned that tools is a big topic for roadmaps, and what I found is that they're kind of all over the place. Because I work with enterprise and B2B, that environment was very comfortable with Gantt charts because it was a delivery roadmap and a feature roadmap. And so literally we would have our stories in Jira, we would have estimates in Jira, but then I would have to put everything into a PowerPoint presentation because that was the way it was preferred. Also, depending on the stakeholder, they want to see that format. So for example, I think there are some marketing folks here. To get my marketing partners to go into Confluence, say, or to kind of see those things was just not effective. So having my roadmap in a PowerPoint form and be able to provide context was actually very important for those stakeholders, and for sales, for example. I have seen roadmaps also in tools like Smartsheets, if it's like a startup. I've seen it in Product Board. That was actually really popular with the new CPO that we just onboarded. AHA is very popular with some of the PM communities that I've worked with. So there are a number of ones. Pendo is used by another company that I work with in the Insight portfolio. So there are a number of different products. It's really, I would say, it's really what's more effective for the stakeholder you're communicating with, because I found I've used several sometimes just to get the right message across. In terms of socializing, I don't know how many of you work with product councils, but that's becoming much more of a formal governance and a formal mechanism for key stakeholders across growth stage startups to be able to get transparency into roadmaps.
Who is part of the product council?
Yeah, so usually the product council is comprised of top-level executives. So the COO, or if it's a larger organization, it's a division head. It also includes product, so product leads and administers the product council, and then it'll include key stakeholders from sales, marketing, usually support. And it's really a forum to provide transparency. So for example, one organization that I know of uses the product council to go over OKRs. And if the product teams are missing their OKRs, they will literally band together and think about ways to help support the product teams to meet those OKRs. It also has been used as a decision-making mechanism for sometimes top-level prioritization needs. Because sometimes if you're a small startup and you're bootstrapped and you don't have that many resources, product will have a set roadmap, but maybe a big customer comes along and wants all of these needs. Then that becomes a critical question of organizational level of how do you pivot, or do you pivot? And then what's at stake and what are the risks? And it allows your stakeholders to weigh in. So in those environments, a high-level roadmap that provides a little bit more granularity on assumptions for delivery is very, very important. And then on the day-to-day tactical level, the socialization happens depending on your sprint cadences, maybe every 2 weeks, every month, and it would happen. So I used to show my roadmap at every demo. So I'd say, this is those features developed, and this is what we're thinking about doing coming up. This is why we're doing it. Here's the sort of data that we've collected. Additionally, my roadmaps are always made available on Confluence and also on our internal intranet so that anyone can access them. And then depending on how close you are with your stakeholders, Like I would literally go and socialize with each stakeholder on a bi-weekly or a monthly basis, depending on their comfort level and how I felt that they were willing to engage and accept some of the feature delivery that's coming down the line, or some of the goals that we were working on.
So let me ask this, in your experience, especially with product development roadmap, feature roadmap, do you have developers and designers part of that group that's actually building the roadmap, or how? Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things. I would say it's also dependent on the culture of your organization. When I was at American Express Global Business Travel, I would invite my engineers to join actually customer and user research sessions and design sessions, and also solicit ideas and get backlog items. It felt like culturally it wasn't as like something that was like as appealing to some of my end members. At Quartet, it was actually a very big part of our backlog development, and then also thinking through our roadmap, because some of the technology was sometimes new, and we had a ton of tech debt. So for example, we had an algorithm that surfaced patients that would need help. So our engineers actually needed to help provide what the options would be and what the end solution could potentially look like. Additionally, our designers were the leads for a lot of the user research. So they would come up and ideate with a lot of the ideas, and then we would go out and figure out what's on our design backlog, and then go and do the research. So it's very much a balanced team approach to thinking through how to enhance the products for our users.
The question would be, so product roadmap came about when the way how products were developed was very different than now, especially when it comes to digital product. So do you think that with this continuous delivery, continuous deployment approaches to how we launch products, do you still need product roadmaps at all?
So I'm going to give my own personal opinion, because I think that it goes sometimes against the grain of what's being shared today. Because nowadays there is a movement towards looking at roadmaps that are very outcomes focused, which is really important, and then the outcomes focused roadmaps then are, you know, the confidence level is only so much depending on what you can deliver within a 1-year period. One of the clients that we worked with recently had really huge goals to exit. The goals were 40% top line growth and 120% retention. So humongous goals. And to get to those goals, literally in the room with a VC demanding a feature-based roadmap. And the reason for that is because ultimately the roadmap is a communications tool to say, how are you going to get to the strategy? And when you have these aggressive goals, you need hard dates potentially and hard information for dependencies. And that's why I don't know if they're ever going to go away, because there are going to be these scenarios. I've been in it twice now where you're trying to kind of convert companies and try to deliver that value so that you can get to an exit.
In my experience, VCs are extremely bad product designers and managers, so I wouldn't kind of count them in. But I was more referring is, so if you have product roadmap, then you have the most important thing at the top. And what I often see is you do the top item, the most important thing, and when you release it, the rest of the roadmap completely changes. And then basically having this product roadmap, it feels very futile attempt at predicting the future.
Yeah, and that's actually an important point, because that's why the outcomes-based roadmaps are now becoming much more popular, because roadmaps ultimately isn't really a promise, and as soon as you put dates and commitments, it becomes taken as a commitment, when we know that things are changing all the time, especially with startups. And that's why creating a startup or creating a roadmap that's focused on an OKR and a mission vision, and then putting your confidence level really does help to set those expectations. I also prefaced So people get annoyed because I used to put preliminary on all my roadmaps. But that actually is a way to say, you know, this is all preliminary because we are in a dynamic environment. And that's especially the case for startups. Like large enterprises tend to move a little bit slower. But even then, you can always caveat preliminary because you never know what may change within the organization.
Can you describe a bit more what is outcome-based product roadmap? How does that look? I'm not really familiar with that term.
Yeah, that was the type of roadmap I was kind of describing. I'll have actually visuals if any of you come to the workshop tomorrow. So essentially, it's a roadmap that you start with layering on what you have agreed upon with the organization as the mission vision. And then you have OKRs that ideally you've agreed upon with the organization. If you don't, because you're still trying to figure out what the organization is, then you put your hypothesis. So once you just decide on your OKRs, they could be something like you want to increase acquisition by, let's use a small number, like 5%, not like the startup I was working on, but you want to increase acquisition by 5% because you don't know what's going to get that, and you don't know what your sales and marketing team's capacity may be. You can say one of the big things that you're working on, because I've seen this too, is you're going to be working on growth, and specifically within your website. And you might be trying experiments with the website, but then also working on experiments with your product. Maybe another growth is seeing if you want to do like an invite to create more of a network effect within your product. And those kind of things kind of say are experiments. And so that way it shows that you're still investigating, but doing something as a PM to figure out how to get to your OKRs. And they may change because those are experiments. And then, depending on the frequency for how you're communicating it, we'll understand that those items may change. And they may be a huge list of experiments, but the idea is to get to more and more confidence as to how you're going to be increasing those numbers, because then it becomes more of a metric.
Yeah, so you mentioned tech debt, that some of your project had major tech debt. Have you ever worked on any roadmap which addresses this? So typically, the way how we do it, there's two types of feature. One is the sexy one, which goes in the front end. It's very easy to market. And the other one, refactor the infrastructure. Not sexy, management hates it, you have to do it. How do you balance these two? Do you communicate these items on the roadmap?
Yeah.
Or do you do separate technical roadmaps?
So I want to first caveat that the engineers, I always defer to the engineers to tell me sort of how they want to do things, and technically I would defer to my engineers on any sort of major tech debt or refactoring. But with that in mind, and I will tell a cautionary tale, my belief is that it's really, really important for PMs to understand tech debt and to also include that in the roadmap. So the reason I say this is because I've seen actually 2 organizations now drown from tech debt. Actually, it took a whole year for one of the startups I was in to address tech debt, which ultimately resulted in the full C-suite turnover because we couldn't deliver in a whole year. And it's actually okay in some ways because growth stage startups are always going to have tech debt because you're moving so quickly that it starts to accumulate and has to be taken care of. So the big things about the tech debt is one, to your point, I kind of feel like it's really important to have a holistic roadmap because then you have to trade off with the limited resources that you have on what you're deferring to tech debt and then what you can actually ultimately deliver and making sure everyone is on point. The other thing is, and this, I'm just speaking from my like really crazy experience where the tech debt touched everything. It was a whole database migration. But ultimately, you want to figure out ways to find value and deliver value as that tech debt is being addressed, depending on the timelines. Because ultimately, tech is on the hook. So in our situation, tech was on the hook because it ultimately became, the issue that didn't get resolved and didn't get delivered within a certain amount of time. But as a PMs, you can't grow your product if tech isn't there. So the way that we were able to try to couch it for our team was we actually figured out ways to deliver value on the design front. And then we also figured out ways to deliver value on the sales and marketing front so that our tech teams had time to be able to deliver. Because you can still acquire users or conduct tests or even sign up for little pilots. And those are ways they can help couch it.
Cool. Any other questions?
Just to touch on the technical side, one effective way that I found was when you need to sell it internally, is you figure out what's the cost of not doing it, and that can be a you know, a value, a financial value, or it can be a scaling one. You know, we will stop at 100,000 users or whatever that is, and then you can actually you can compare the sexy feature, what's the value that we're gonna get from that, versus what's the cost of not doing this other thing.
How does your week look like, and how does your day look like?
Oh, okay. And is that as a PM or?
Yeah, on a professional side.
No, I say that just because like my current role is also consulting and trying to kind of grow the startups and the companies that are with within the Insight Venture Partners portfolio. So it's a little bit different now, but I can kind of walk through my PM experience. So with the last startup that I was with, I started my day every day checking our metrics. So I don't know how many of you have dashboards, and because what was interesting is that instrumentation didn't happen for us until right before I joined, and the data was super messy. So I was trying to figure out what was real in the data in terms of my usage metrics, what was real in the data in terms of customer metrics, and figuring out what was the actual usage. And then if we had delivered a new feature, monitoring usage and the funnel for the feature, basically on a day-to-day basis. We ran 2-week sprints. So depending on where we were, the 2-week sprints, we would have our grooming, our sprint planning. We also had daily stand-ups, and then we had retros and demos. Usually within a 2-week sprint, I would meet with our stakeholders, and I try to do it bi-weekly because we were, registration moving really quickly. So I would meet with marketing. We had patient success, because it was a healthcare startup. I also met with our account development firms, and then we also had inside sales, and we had teams that went out and recruited doctors and physicians, because the way healthcare works in the US is that it very much is reaching out to a lot of physicians. A lot of times too, we didn't have scrum of scrums. I don't know if you all have that. So a lot of times I literally went to each PM to ask kind of what they were doing to make sure that we had synergies with our development. And a big chunk of my time was also doing user research. So talking to different doctors, listening in on patient calls, and understanding if some of the answers or things that they were doing were in line with some of the things that we had done. Because that was the company that we were stuck in a large amount of tech debt. A lot of the times it was really thinking about what was the strategy and how do we deliver on incremental value for our users and our patients and our customers at the end of the day. So I think at a big general level, to answer your question, a lot of it was working with my immediate Scrum teams on our sprint ceremonies and the delivery. Working with design, and then working with cross-functional partners on really thinking through the strategy, and then working across the PM teams on thinking through how we're going to ladder up with a lot of the initiatives that we had going forward. And it's also different, to caveat for you, it's also different depending on what level you are in. So when I was a PM at the startup, I was working as a senior manager level, because we didn't have that many layers. At a director level, it became much more about managing and sort of working through a lot of the strategic needs amongst my portfolio with the stakeholders. Does that help?
Well, definitely, thank you.
Sorry, I have a lot of questions. You said you're
You can
talking...
just make it a personal conversation.
I'm trying to speak up so everyone hear it.
And
Please
let
let
me
me
know,
know if
I'm
you
sorry
don't.
my energy is really low because it's been a long travel, like day and a half. So if anyone sort of needs to kind of change topics too, let me know. Not you.
You were mentioning speaking to customers, your end users. What's your opinion about personal meetings versus video call? Obviously, one is cheaper, the other one could involve traveling, cost, so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I think it depends on what type of experiments you're working on. So generally personal is a little bit better, and also you can layer on depending if it's B2B or B2C. customers sometimes want to see you, and your sales teams want to use you as a pawn. So it's kind of like one of those situations where you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. So generally for sort of like if you're trying to ideate or get more qualitative information about big ideas on what potential features or delivery, generally in person is a little bit better. So for example, I had security officers that used my product, and they were for a large investment bank. I went to their offices and saw how they worked, and it was really important because they had huge monitors on their screen, and they monitored Twitter feeds to see what are the big things that would happen. Is there a shooting across the street? They literally had a team of people monitoring 24/7 if there were issues. And they had such tight security is that they would see people going in and out, and they would monitor people going in and out of the building because they were one of those banks that also had stipulated that you can have drones flying within a certain area because it was like that tight of a security. And it was important for us to see how our little app really fit in that kind of type of ecosystem, because we realized that they needed a large screen that also integrated with all of these third-party feeds, and would probably need to integrate with like satellite phones because they were having people travel to some very dangerous regions. And so that was very important for us to understand their workflow and their environment, and how they were juggling not just travel risks but also security risks within their various offices. We also did video calls, and video calls are really great for what I find is more user research with the actual app and usability, because you get to see kind of how people are actually using the product, and assuming it's a web app and even like a mobile app, it's much more easier to track, and then also have someone take notes and have various people look at it. So that's what I would invite my Eng team to join, and it would be less cumbersome for them to join. And that was also very interesting because you can also see maybe level of sophistications. And I say this primarily in the travel and also healthcare context, because I don't want to sort of like knock on anyone, but what I found is that those who are in, at least my experience, have been travel, like travel managers, are not necessarily as sophisticated with technology. And what I've seen sometimes with some of our physicians that we used are not as sophisticated. So seeing them actually use it and not be flustered by someone being in front of them was actually very insightful to understand the usability in their day-to-day. Because a doctor, at least in the US, is not necessarily in front of anything other than, we call them EHR, electronic health records, which are terrible. And just not necessarily as savvy with some different technology that they have. So it really depends on the context and type of project.
So I feel like by now we've mentioned a lot of we talked about different environments, startup and enterprise, different complexities, the importance of roadmaps, how to share it. We covered a lot of ground, and you guys asked some brilliant questions, and I feel like there's a good room for another 2 or 3 questions before we wrap it up. So here's your chance, like maybe think of your own environment, what sort of complexities are you facing, and maybe you want to get some insight, so ask now, insight that could be shared with everyone. Here it is.
Earlier you mentioned that you joined at least one startup where you needed to set up the whole agile process. So if you needed to highlight, let's say, 3 main points, main crucial elements of that process, what would those be?
Of setting up the process, or just agile process?
I would say agile, yeah. So
yeah.
In other words, if you don't do anything else, as long as you do these 3, you'll be 80% fine.
Okay.
Oh no.
I know. So a big one that I was kind of surprised that had a little bit of resistance was just having daily stand-ups. Because some of the engineers and the developers that I worked with were definitely not quite disciplined with just having stand-ups. And that was kind of, it sounds so simple, but that was just kind of key. We had stand-ups actually at noon that slowly inched up to 9:30, which to me is still really late, but then that's, I wake up at 5:30. So that that was definitely like the bare minimum of an of an agile ceremony. Another one I would say, if I had just kind of layer on comfort level with engineers, is grooming, because it's really important to have all the developers on the same page, or just thinking about complexity as they're estimating, and thinking through story pointing. Because I also had developers that came from lots of different places and competencies, and it really also helped with the developers to transfer knowledge, because we didn't do paired programming. And we had high turnover because it's a growth stage startup. So that in itself was really huge in at least level setting, even if we didn't use the velocity to plan future work. And then sprint planning, I would say, is definitely also huge, because and I would say sprint planning is important because we would always grab one engineer that wasn't the engineering manager to join. And that also prevents the engineering manager from just doing too much of simply the planning, and allows the different engineers to think really critically about some of the problems. It also, I talking about culture a little bit with growth stage companies, it also really helps with establishing ownership and the knowledge transfer. And they seem like really basic, but after setting up processes a couple of times, I'm realizing that those little simple basic pieces are just huge.
So Marissa picked her 3, and I'll say without retrospectives and demos, you're screwed.
I would totally add those too, but
you just gave me 3, right?
Go ahead.
At the start of the meetup, you mentioned that in travel industry a lot of things happen offline. Are there any best ways how to catch that data and bring it into your digital data?
Yeah, how do you learn about that?
Yeah. Oh gosh, the offline world is really fascinating to me, because American Express actually was like really well known for offline servicing, and then I saw it terrible in other places, including the travel space. So one of the things that, it sounds really terrible, but if you can't get third-party, I would say, products that you can integrate within your product space, even just having manual data, because let's say you're bootstrapped, would be just amazing with just capturing the data. So for example, when I was in healthcare, a lot of our manual servicing for our doctors was really offline. It was that Wizard of Oz thing where you just have people in the background trying to kind of make things happen. And so what they would do is they would literally capture a spreadsheet of doctor, time, issue, how they resolved it, which is going through our back-end system to then, like one of the key things is we would have, duplicate records of a patient. They would merge it, and then we would see and count how many of those issues would happen, and then try to think about how to prioritize them with the backlog. Within travel, that was also the case in terms of manual. We started with a manual kind of effort before we started building out for it, because we had a service offering. It was the one I mentioned earlier, which is proactive traveler services, something else at the end. But essentially was thinking about if we anticipated a storm, because we got flight data, like for example, New York just had a storm, we would literally rebook someone in advance so that they would get stuck in the storm. And that was a huge kind of value driver. And to do that, the team started out with a website that collected people's preferences. And then on the back end, because the preferences was basically manual, we would go in and make sure we check with the travelers on their rebooking preferences with a travel agent and capture that information. And that then provided the basis for information to continue to iterate on that experience. But ideally, if you have any sort of support third-party products, that would actually be ideal to be able to capture some of the information a little bit more automated if you can kind of get there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And then there's also kind of a whole host of other things.
Thank you.
So come on, folks, time for one more.
So what's your thinking about setting hypothesis? You've mentioned that for startups that don't have product market fit. So I just want to get a bit how you're thinking about setting up hypothesis. So, or do you need a bit more on that?
Who is involved in that process?
Yeah.
Or?
So how are you thinking about setting them? The process of researching and getting to the bits, because a lot of the times I feel like there's many things happening in your product, and you might not be sure, okay, what's my top hypothesis that I want to focus on. So thinking around that.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it sounds like you already have a product that's already maybe built or like a prototype.
So I'm here at d.labs, so we're working multiple products.
Oh, okay. So maybe what I'll do is talk about maybe just like one product to start and to give you the hypothesis for whether it works to find product market fit.
So to be more specific, what I was asking, so there's when you have a funnel and you're not sure which part of the funnel is working or not. So, or you're just going from the top and then working on optimizing bits and pieces from top to bottom, or is there any other way that you're approaching this? Setting hypothesis on optimizing the top of the funnel, or you have some other way of looking at it.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah. So, and then I'm assuming that there maybe was like light instrumentation or no instrumentation.
If you have anything like that around instrumentation, I'd love to hear it. But we're using just the usual Google Analytics and Hotjar and things like that.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So I guess just to start, it sounds like it's like diagnosing maybe what potentially is happening, and then trying to optimize or increase usage and completion of the funnel. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess to start with hypothesis, so I usually just personally like to start with qualitative to start, because you never, at least in my experience with some of my products, I don't know sometimes if a salesperson for a B2B environment may have forced the product on somebody, or there may be things that are happening that's creating like non-organic growth that I may not be seeing. So usually what I try to do is I try to canvas, if it's in the B2B space, like sales or account folks or anyone that I know is familiar with anyone who may be potentially using it, and try to get like a customer list or a user list. And if it's like one of my apps is more B2C, looking at like who's potentially using it and reaching out and actually trying to get some more qualitative feedback on, when did they receive it, how did they receive it, what exactly is the value that it brings, and not necessarily asking those direct questions, but really just trying to get an understanding of really like the context for the product or the app that I had. So for example, my portal product was actually like a product that was given to all of the customers. What we found out though is before I had inherited it, it was really literally a page with all of these different links for Amex products. And a lot of our travelers would go there and they would say, like, click on a link for visa services. But the really interesting part was that there was a huge need in the middle market space for an intranet product, because a lot of them may not have intranet. So it actually would become really sticky, and that became like the base of our strategy to create a portal for the middle market segment, primarily for travel managers. And that came from those qualitative interviews of first figuring out who the customers were, and then getting a good really sense of what potentially the value would bring, which is very different from the actual usage of the product. And then the other thing is for funnel optimization. I mean, it sounds like you have some analytics, but it's starting with the analytics. The reason I don't start with analytics, as I may have mentioned at my startup, is some data can be really messy, because it depends on how your data is flowing into the product and how it was tagged or how it was instrumented. So I found sometimes that my data didn't really tell me very much, and I was trying to figure out the truth underlying the data. So one example is in the healthcare space, a lot of the doctors are too busy to use the product. So they may have signed up for the product, but they have their office managers or their nurses become the user. That creates a false read on what's really happening with the data. And this is why I try to start with the qualitative and then layer on from the quantitative, or if I look at the quantitative, try to figure out what's going on there. And you can start with the top of the funnel or start at the end. But at the end of the funnel may not really help you with anything if it's a conversion that doesn't give you, say, like, if it's actually not resulting, say, dollars, because I feel like that ultimately is what proves that they're willing to pay for something and then renew or to re-engage. Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Oh, okay, so unless someone is burning with one more thing. Oh, God, Ishan, go ahead.
I'm kind of delirious at this point from the sake of studying.
It will be an easy question.
Okay.
So do you see any particular reason that so many successful product managers are women?
Oh, I don't really know that. I don't actually know about that, but did you have a specific question?
No, but it's really, I read a lot that women in general seems to be much better at product management, and wanted to know whether you would share that observation, and maybe if you do, some insights there.
Yeah, I really haven't seen that. We actually onboarded a few recent Insight Portfolio CPOs who actually turned out to be male, and I don't know what that means. But one of the things that's been really interesting, at least amongst the Insight venture partners, kind of like ecosystem, and specifically people we work with, is how do you become a chief product officer? Because it becomes harder and harder. I don't know how many of you are in product or if this really matters. But product in itself is really a weird, fuzzy role. And then to get to that leadership position, which means many different things at many different companies, is even harder. And I've seen at least one CPO turnover, actually a couple now, because it's such a hard job. And so, you know, I'm putting in a plug, but the VC that we work with and a couple of the guys, they're actually starting out with a couple of blog posts on what it means to be a successful chief product officer and how do you transition into that role. Because everything that makes you a successful product manager becomes magnified even more as you get up to that. So one example is I was participating in trying to figure out how to craft a board presentation for a new CPO. He onboarded about 3 weeks ago and had to go through the framework for creating a product strategy, and he needs to put it all in 2 slides. He's delayed because it was due today, and I just kind of think that just figuring out information and having to do that really quickly and that scale is really impossible for a lot of people. So it becomes skills that you have to develop, and some people don't even know what they are. So it doesn't really answer your question. Maybe at some future point I'll start noticing the gender balance. I haven't seen it as of yet.
Cool. I'd really like to thank you wholeheartedly for being here and for speaking and for having energy. And one big round of applause. Great. I also would like to thank d.labs for hosting us tonight. And if you'd like to linger and speak for a little bit longer and socialize, yeah, we have a few minutes, so let's do that casually before we all sneak out of here. Thank you for coming.
I was wondering if you'll come late. Before I forget,